Look at this image of Lake Havasu. The water is deep, vibrant blue, and packed with boats. It looks like a desert paradise completely immune to the historic droughts ravaging the American West. But this pristine view is a massive, carefully maintained engineering illusion. While Lake Powell and Lake Mead are collapsing just upstream, Lake Havasu is kept artificially full to mask a terrifying reality. Just miles away, the entire water infrastructure of the American Southwest is sliding toward a total systemic failure. If these artificial levels drop by just a few feet, the pumps stop. When that happens, 27 million people across Phoenix, Tucson, Los Angeles, and San Diego will turn on their taps to find nothing but dry air. Tucked away along the shorelines sit the massive intake structures of the Mark Wilmer Pumping Plant and the Whitsett intake. These gargantuan concrete installations are the literal straw drinking from Lake Havasu, pushing billions of gallons of water over mountains and through hundreds of miles of open-air concrete canals. But the system is running out of time. If upstream supplies collapse, these pumps will begin sucking air, instantly cutting off the lifeblood of the nation's most populated desert cities. How is it that a lake can look completely healthy while the river system feeding it enters a terminal death spiral? Today, we pull back the curtain on the hidden infrastructure threshold that turns this thriving desert playground into a useless mudflat overnight. Welcome to Lake Havasu City, Arizona. Established in the 1960s, this desert oasis has grown into a permanent community of nearly 60,000 residents, swollen by millions of tourists who flock here every single year. The city is world famous for its bizarre and ambitious centerpiece, the historic London Bridge. In 1968, the city's founder purchased the actual stone bridge from the City of London, dismantled it piece by piece, shipped it across the Atlantic, and rebuilt it right here in the middle of the Arizona desert. Today, daily life revolves entirely around this artificial waterway. Jet skis zip beneath the historic arches, million-dollar resort homes line the channels, and a thriving multi-billion-dollar tourism economy depends on the lake remaining at a reliable, picture-perfect depth. For the people who live, work, and vacation here, the water crisis feels like someone else's problem. When you can look out your window and see a vast expanse of blue stretching out toward Parker Dam, it is easy to believe that the Southwest water crisis is nothing more than media sensationalism. But beneath the surface of this vibrant community lies a fragile reality. Lake Havasu City is built on top of a giant pass-through tray for the West's water supply. It does not own the water it sits on, and its survival is tethered to a plumbing system that is rapidly running dry. The hidden threat lies in the fundamental engineering definition of Lake Havasu itself. It is not a true storage reservoir. Unlike Lake Mead or Lake Powell, which are designed to capture and hold years of river runoff, Lake Havasu is a highly controlled, artificial pass-through pool. Created by the construction of Parker Dam, the Bureau of Reclamation manages Havasu within a strict, razor-thin operating band. They intentionally keep it full so that the massive aqueduct intake pumps have enough hydraulic head pressure to function. However, data from NASA's GRACE satellite tracking system reveals a devastating truth about the broader Colorado River basin. The region is locked in a relentless, 26-year structural deficit. More water is legally promised to states, cities, and agricultural fields than the river actually produces. Because federal water managers continuously drain the massive upstream reservoirs to keep Lake Havasu filled to its precise operating line, the local residents are kept completely in the dark. They look at a full lake and assume everything is fine, entirely unaware that the upstream safety buffers feeding this pool are nearly empty. The illusion of abundance at Lake Havasu is actively blinding millions of people to the fact that the entire river system is on the verge of a catastrophic operational failure that cannot be undone by a single wet winter. To understand how we ended up on the brink of this disaster, we have to look back to the foundational mistake made over a century ago. In 1922, representatives from 7 western states gathered to sign the historic Colorado River Compact. This legal framework divided the river's water between the upper basin states and the lower basin states. But there was a fatal flaw built directly into the math. At the time of the signing, politicians looked at stream flow gauge data from the early 20th century, which happened to coincide with one of the wettest periods in the river's entire history. They estimated the river's annual flow at an average of 15 million acre-feet and allocated the water based on that assumption. However, early hydrologists and independent scientists explicitly warned the government that these numbers were a dangerous historical anomaly. They pointed out that long-term triggering data showed the Colorado River's true historic average was much lower, frequently dipping into severe, multi-decade megadroughts. These urgent scientific warnings were completely ignored by corporate developers, agricultural syndicates, and expansionist politicians who wanted to justify building massive desert metropolises like Los Angeles and Phoenix. The warnings were pushed aside, laws were passed, and massive concrete dams began blocking the river. The system was intentionally over-allocated from day one, built on a mathematical lie that prioritized short-term real estate booms over long-term ecological and hydrological reality. For decades, the system seemed to work because the desert populations were small and didn't use their full legal allotments. But as the cities grew to their maximum limits, the structural deficit began to bite, exposing a century-old mistake that water managers are now completely powerless to fix through traditional engineering methods. To understand how we ended up on the brink of this disaster, we have to look back to the foundational mistake made over a century ago. In 1922, representatives from 7 western states gathered to sign the historic Colorado River Compact. This legal framework divided the river's water between the upper basin states and the lower basin states. But there was a fatal flaw built directly into the math. At the time of the signing, politicians looked at streamflow gauge data from the early 20th century, which happened to coincide with one of the wettest periods in the river's entire history. They estimated the river's annual flow at an average of 15 million acre-feet and allocated the water based on that assumption. However, early hydrologists and independent scientists explicitly warned the government that these numbers were a dangerous historical anomaly. They pointed out that long-term triggering data showed the Colorado River's true historic average was much lower, frequently dipping into severe, multi-decade megadroughts. These urgent scientific warnings were completely ignored by corporate developers, agricultural syndicates, and expansionist politicians who wanted to justify building massive desert metropolises like Los Angeles and Phoenix. The warnings were pushed aside, laws were passed, and massive concrete dams began blocking the river. The system was intentionally over-allocated from day one, built on a mathematical lie that prioritized short-term real estate booms over long-term ecological and hydrological reality. For decades, the system seemed to work because the desert populations were small and didn't use their full legal allotments. But as the cities grew to their maximum limits, the structural deficit began to bite, exposing a century-old mistake that water managers are now completely powerless to fix through traditional engineering methods. The overallocation of the river quickly escalated from a political disagreement into a dangerous structural showdown. In 1934, as construction began on Parker Dam to create Lake Havasu, the state of Arizona panicked. Fearing that California was embarking on a massive water heist that would strip Arizona of its future growth, the governor of Arizona deployed the state militia. Armed troops traveled via ferry boats, mockingly dubbed the Arizona Navy, to the construction site with strict orders to halt the dam's progress by force. While the federal government eventually stepped in to de-escalate the armed standoff, the geopolitical war over the river was officially set in stone. The completion of Parker Dam permanently altered the ecology and hydrology of the lower Colorado River. It created an artificial plumbing system that prioritized urban expansion over environmental sustainability. The true disaster, however, was not a sudden explosion or a dam breach. It was the slow, irreversible creation of total urban dependency. By carving out canals and stabilization pools like Lake Havasu, the government allowed major metropolitan hubs to grow far beyond the natural carrying capacity of their local environments. Today, the human impact of this dependency is staggering. The Colorado River has lost up to 20% of its historic flow due to shifting climate patterns and intense evaporation losses from open-air desert reservoirs. The river that once roared all the way to the Gulf of California now completely dies out in the Mexican desert, miles before reaching the sea. Entire ecosystems have been wiped out, groundwater tables have plummeted, and millions of people have been left entirely reliant on a fragile, synthetic water loop. The shocking reality is that the modern American Southwest was built on a wet historical anomaly that will never return, leaving a massive population stranded on infrastructure designed for a river that no longer exists. For decades, water authorities and federal managers knew the math behind the Colorado River was entirely broken. Internal reports from agencies like the Bureau of Reclamation warned as early as the late 20th century that a prolonged drought would trigger a systemic collapse of the reservoirs. Yet, this critical information was heavily downplayed in public messaging. Instead of enforcing strict conservation measures or halting unsustainable urban sprawl in the desert, authorities engaged in a carefully managed public relations campaign. They deliberately chose to keep Lake Havasu's water levels perfectly stable and pristine. Because they knew that if the millions of residents in Southern California and Arizona saw Lake Havasu dropping, it would trigger widespread public panic, tank real estate values, and stall billions of dollars in economic development. To maintain this illusion, federal managers systematically drained the massive upstream safety reserves of Lake Mead and Lake Powell, letting those giant reservoirs drop to historic, bone-dry lows just to keep the downstream delivery pool looking full. The most shocking hidden fact is that the system has now hit a dangerous, ratchet effect. Because the upstream buffers have been completely depleted to hide the crisis, even a short-term wet winter can no longer save the overall infrastructure from its impending structural deadline. That brings us directly to the terrifying reality of today. The Bureau of Reclamation's latest 24-month study outlines an incredibly grim forecast for the entire basin. The winter snowpack across the Rocky Mountains peaked at a miserable 60% of the historical median. This catastrophic lack of runoff has forced emergency water allocation cuts across the Southwest. To prevent the entire system from dropping below the minimum power pool, the level where turbines can no longer generate electricity, the federal government has been forced to mandate a massive reduction in water releases from Glen Canyon Dam. This upstream restriction means that Lake Mead is now dropping at an accelerated pace toward its absolute dead pool limit. For the scientists and engineers currently monitoring the system's sensors, the data reads like a slow-motion train wreck. Sensor readings at Hoover Dam are showing water pressures and intake elevations dangerously close to the point where downstream flow stops entirely. If Lake Mead hits dead pool, the flow of the Colorado River effectively terminates at the Hoover Dam wall. This means the supply line feeding Lake Havasu will be completely cut off. Hydrologists are working around the clock, tracking every drop of water moving through the basin, but they are running out of operational maneuvers. They can no longer simply shift water from one reservoir to another to hide the deficit. The shell game is officially over. The warning signs happening today perfectly mirror the triggering data from the worst megadroughts of the past 1,000 years, but this time, there are 27 million human lives directly attached to the dying river. Climate scientists and hydrological engineers at Colorado State University's Colorado Water Center have issued a series of blunt warnings. They state clearly that the entire basin storage system is sliding toward an unavoidable system crash. Their research emphasizes that the Southwest is no longer experiencing a temporary drought, but rather a permanent aridification of the region, a fundamental shift in the climate baseline that reduces natural river runoff every single year. Look at the post-2026 Operational Guidelines Draft Environmental Impact Statement released by federal authorities. This critical document outlines the desperate measures required to keep the water system from failing entirely when the current interstate water agreements officially expire at the end of this year. Experts predicting the next steps warn that if the 7 basin states fail to reach a mutual, drastic compromise on usage cuts, the federal government will be forced to step in and unilaterally impose unprecedented cutbacks. For Arizona, this could mean an immediate, federally mandated 77% reduction in its Colorado River allocation. This isn't a worst-case scenario for the distant future. This is the baseline operational plan currently being drawn up by scientists who know the water simply is not there anymore. If Lake Havasu drops below its critical pumping elevation, the impact will be immediate, catastrophic, and completely unprecedented in modern American history. The Central Arizona Project Aqueduct and the Colorado River Aqueduct to Southern California will instantly shut down as their massive intake pumps begin sucking air. This will abruptly sever the primary water supply for 27 million people, plunging major metropolitan economies into an immediate existential crisis. Without this water, the highly productive agricultural fields of the Imperial Valley will dry up within weeks, triggering severe food shortages and an economic shockwave across the entire nation. In cities like Phoenix, Tucson, and Los Angeles, municipal water districts will be forced to implement extreme, mandatory rationing. Water pressure in urban grids will plummet, rendering sanitation systems useless and severely disrupting operations at major regional hospitals. Fire departments will face empty hydrants in regions already prone to catastrophic wildfires. This won't just be an inconvenience, it will be a full-scale humanitarian and economic disaster, forcing a mass migration out of the desert as the infrastructure that allowed these cities to exist in the first place completely fails to deliver. The hard, unyielding physics of the Colorado River infrastructure lead to one inescapable conclusion. Once Lake Mead hits dead pool, no water passes Hoover Dam, and Lake Havasu will drop to an empty mudflat within days. The ultimate unanswered question hangs over the entire American Southwest. When the current legal water agreements officially expire on December 31, 2026, will the states find a way to compromise, or will the federal government be forced to turn off the taps? The clock is ticking down to an absolute deadline, and the water is running out. In our next analysis, we will dive deep into the secret engineering failures currently plaguing the lower outlet works at Glen Canyon Dam, failures that could trigger this system crash much sooner than anyone is willing to admit. Share this video with anyone you know living in the Southwest who still thinks their water supply is completely secure just because their local lake looks full. Subscribe to our channel right now to join a community of forensic disaster analysts dedicated to exposing the hidden infrastructure crises threatening our world. Don't miss our upcoming deep dive into the hidden structural damage of the Glen Canyon Dam bypass tubes.